First of all, thank you very much, Regina, for, on short notice, actually reading the book. Not even academics read books that they review. When busy scientists at IFPRI read books from academics, it's a treat for the academics. So thank you very much. You're exactly right. It's not just resistance from the political left, from social justice or environmental groups that undermine support for the Green Revolution approach. There was simultaneous opposition from the political right, from Reaganite and Thatcherite elements beginning in the 1980s that thought the state should not be in the lead in development. The job of the state was to get out of the way and let private investment and deregulated markets take over. And that influence was just as nefarious, in my view, as the influence of those on the left that were skeptical about fertilizers and high-yielding seeds. I've often said if India were to come to the World Bank today and present its plan for a green revolution, it would be rejected because it included subsidies. It included too much public sector investment in irrigation and fertilizer plants. There were even price guarantees, the Agricultural Prices Commission. It was too interventionist in the market, and it would have been viewed as unsustainable, and it would have been rejected by the Washington consensus. So I agree. It's the political right, not just the political left. On the question of World Bank funding, in part because of this new attitude, yes, they still have resources, but it's not going to agriculture. Since 1980, they've cut the share of their lending to agricultural development from 30% down to less than 10%. So they've mostly walked away from agricultural development. My hope was that the 2008 food price crisis under Robert Zoellick's leadership would bring them back in. I'm not sure that that's going to happen. On the role of the G8, this is fascinating. You're right. It's increasingly not through universal membership IGOs, but through club IGOs that power is exercised. But it comes down in the end to what governments are willing to provide. At Gleneagles in Scotland in 2005, the G8 made a prominent pledge for new assistance to Africa. Well, it's 5 years later, and they're $20 billion behind in delivering on that pledge. So just doing something as a group of 8 at a meeting doesn't make it any more likely if political forces back home aren't in support. And will African governments deliver? I think this is really the key question. And what I try to monitor as best I can from a distance is the performance of African governments in living up to their 2003 Maputo pledge to increase the share of their spending on agriculture from, in most cases, less than 5%, even though 60 or 70% of their population depend upon agriculture for farming, for food and for employment and income, to increase their share of spending on agriculture from 5% up to 10%. And they made that pledge 7 years ago, and 6 or 8 of 47 governments have lived up to that pledge, at least temporarily. I think that's the measure of accountability that I'd like to use to monitor the performance of African governments. So let me stop there and thank you again.
Thank you very much. I'm Werner Kiene. Used to be with the World Food Program, which was praised today. I like that. But thank you, Rob. You managed to provoke us to reactions. And I want to come back to what probably will be the real draw to buy that book, namely your culture war story. And I think Regina alluded a little bit to it. Seems you see the culture wars only on one side. I mean, the foodies and all this. And I wonder whether there is not a similar villain in that war on the other side. And I'm not a historian. You deal with them probably more than I. Normally, when you have these culture wars, the two sides seem to lift the best things of the other side, and some synergy is happening. And I wanted to know from you whether you see some of these synergy. I mean, your milk story shows that it pays to at least differentiate your product, even if you don't do anything with it. So, two questions. the culture war, is that just one villain? It seems you give the villain is more on the left side, and the other side. Are these two trends leading to something new and something better?
I think the culture war could have a nice Hegelian synthetic outcome if it were between the most rigid techno-fundamentalist advocates of the Green Revolution and advocates for agroecology, because you can blend those two approaches effectively. Unfortunately, the debate is too often between advocates of genetic engineering on one hand and organic advocates who have simply ruled it out. They've issued a fatwa. We're not going to have any organic. We're not going to have any genetically engineered crops that'll ever be certified organic. In fact, the organic side even rules out nitrogen fertilizer. They don't say, the organic farmers don't say we should reduce nitrogen fertilizer use in order to solve the dead zone problem in the Gulf of Mexico. In order to be certified organic, you have to reduce it to zero. I think that rigidity on the organic side, as well as the myopia among single-minded advocates for genetic engineering on the other side, is blocking the sort of synthesis that you and I would both like. The kind of farming that I like is integrated. It integrates agroecological approaches, including biological controls, including integrated pest management, including crop rotations, including manuring, including intercropping, and it integrates that with judicious use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. But the rigid organic standard doesn't allow that. So there's some rigidities on both sides that are getting in the way of the synthesis.
Regina, no. Do you want to make any comment?
Well, just a brief comment on this organic. I'm not so sure whether it's a question of either or. I think there's a certain market for organic products, and that's fine. And every farmer who can actually make profitably use of that market should be able to do that. At the same time, I think there is a need to make sure that the conventional agriculture becomes more sustainable. So putting this into one or the other, I think that's kind of the wrong debate. But it often plays out like that.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tom Herlihy. I'm with Land of Lakes. I work in our office here in Arlington, Virginia. I found this just fascinating. I think the book sounds exciting, innovative, comprehensive, and I really enjoyed the commentary too. I think you're honing in on the politics and how the political environment was right, spot on. I'd like to take a step back even further, though. Whenever I get into these meetings and we hear all this talk about fast food and supermarkets, and there seems to be an underlying negative tone that when these go into developing countries, we get problems of obesity, and that was the one problem you cited. I lived in Egypt for 9 years. I don't think there's a country in the world that has a bigger obesity problem than Egypt. And guess what? Fast food restaurants are coming there now. Carrefour, ShopRite, the others, they're all coming there now. It's just going to get worse. I agree with you. But taking a personal history view of this, I think the problem is in the way we live. It's the way we live. We've become a sedentary society. Our public schools are phasing out gym classes. They're not supporting after-school activities. They're not supporting athletic activities. Parks are closing down. In Arlington County, where I live, they're trying to raise the fee for my daughter to play soccer, okay, in these economic times. And I really think that's one of the problems. We've become a sedentary society where children are spending too much time in front of the TV, in front of their computer, in front of all these gadgets, instead of getting out and socializing. And I think as a political economist, as a social scientist, I think we also need to recognize that and recognize that there's some other things going on in our society and what the indirect consequences of those are. Thank you very much. I welcome your comments.
Very, very quickly, those are great comments. And, you're right. It's not all the kinds of food we eat or even the quantity of food we eat. We are becoming a sedentary society in spite of the commercialization of fitness. More people are members of fitness clubs now, but the frequency of exercise is actually declining. In part because commuting time has lengthened. So we're sitting there commuting instead of making use of our fitness club membership. There are more fresh fruits and vegetables available in the supermarkets now than ever before, but daily consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables is declining. Once again, because it's more convenient to buy a frozen microwave dinner if you're coming home late from a full day of work at IFPRI. Kids today have much fancier bicycles, but they don't ride them as often. So I agree with you completely on that end of the story. As regards the obesity crisis in Egypt, I mean, you're there, you're right as well. I mean, there the problem for years was artificially cheap wheat, which made the purchase of bread for a penny. You could get a loaf of bread. It was so cheap that it was fed to the animals. It was so cheap that they used it to wipe up table spills in Cairo. It was so preposterously cheap that Egyptians had an average calorie intake of, it was at or above the European level, something like 4,000 calories a day in some cases in Cairo. You're right. You can't blame McDonald's on that.
From IFPRI and Virginia Tech. Rob, when we wrote our essay on the new century of multi-agriculturalism for the American Agricultural Economics Association a decade ago, it now turns out, I think we were a little more optimistic. So, as you recall, the first half of that essay, we took on what we call the old agenda of the continued ability of the farm sector to extract subsidies and support from industrial economies, and we hope that maybe the next century this problem would fade out, and then we turned to the new agenda, which is this conflict about food systems and so on a bit, and we were optimistic in the sense that I think we sort of saw a live and let live. So you'd have middle-income people going to Walmart to get quality and safe food at low cost, and you'd have what you've called elites going to Whole Foods and buying the attributes they wanted in food. And those two systems would coexist. In fact, I think we even said this is going to be great for agriculture. It will even create some niche markets, not for all of agriculture, but some farmers will prosper from this differentiated products and high-value products. So now, as you said a while ago, now we're already a tenth of the way into the new decade, this century, and it seems we didn't anticipate quite the hostility, if you will, between the two. So one of my questions is whether you look forward longer, whether in fact the political balance does shift a little towards the quality of food type people. If you take a longer run view of the decade, of the century than the first decade. And then another is, which I was hoping you would touch on today. I'm like you. I grew up in the era of bringing down the price of food and technology, synthetic chemicals and so on. And this was the accomplishment of our decade and our parents' decade. So generations. So are we in a new situation? If you add the culture war over agriculture to energy insecurity concerns, terrorism, and then you throw on climate change on top of that, what is the future of agriculture? I mean, is there anything to the foodies argument that we have to have some new agricultural systems? Is agriculture going to just, through that old political power, like you say, be exempt from any carbon reductions, or are there going to be some changes? Are they going to come from technology, or where are they going to come from in the core of agriculture, which is still the bulk agricultural production and will be? So those are a couple of things I sort of wanted to get you to comment on a bit.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, David. One interesting study that I'm surprised doesn't get more attention regarding the environmental performance of agriculture in OECD countries, conventional agriculture, not foodie agriculture. It's a study from the OECD that was produced in 2008 called The Environmental Performance of Agriculture. It compares agriculture in all of the OECD countries together in 1990 to 2004 along various dimensions. And it finds that total volume of production over that 14-year period increased by 5%. Use of water in irrigation declined by something like 10%. excess nitrogen fertilizer use declined by 17%. Pesticide use declined by something like 7%. Greenhouse gas emissions declined by 3%. Energy use in the agricultural sector increased, but it increased at only 1/6 the rate of the rest of the economy. Soil erosion from wind and water decreased. And biodiversity in the sector, measured in terms of the number of varieties planted and the number of animals used, increased. So the notion that conventional farming is on some unsustainable path is simply wrong. If you look at conventional farming in the most advanced industrial countries, conventional farming is already making a transition from the dirty farming that Rachel Carson correctly criticized in Silent Spring to what's called precision farming, where farmers save money by using GPS systems to auto-steer their tractors and to put the chemicals only on that part of the field where they're needed and only in the amount needed. Other kinds of remote sensing systems, infrared signatures tell you how much nitrogen now to use, not too much, not too little. Laser leveled fields prevent the runoff of water. Drip irrigation prevents the waste of water. Genetically engineered crops allow you to control pests and weeds, burning less diesel fuel, using fewer chemicals. We now have systems that will insert fertilizer under the ground at exactly the level and at exactly the spot in the soil where the roots of the plant that has been planted through an auto-steering GPS system will grow so that there's no wasted nitrogen at all. The future of this is, of course, unacceptable to organized environmentalists because, well, I think for two reasons. First, because it's the kind of system that is currently at least affordable only to highly capitalized and specialized farmers, and the environmental community wants to champion small farmers engaged in a traditional diversity of occupations and activities. And second, because of the concept of using technology to engineer nature and to dominate nature rather than to imitate nature, that's unacceptable to Carsonian environmentalists as well. But I think we have to acknowledge, if you want to find a way to grow more food with fewer impacts on the environment, the solution isn't to go back to something pre-industrial or to abandon technology. The solution is to make additional investments in technology. That seems to be what the OECD world is already doing, entirely apart from the culture war. I worry about the culture war because of the impact it's going to have on developing countries. It's going to leave Africa in a kind of a multi-agriculturalism where smallholders in the countryside will be struggling with traditional techniques and not doing much better, while a few growers of organic baby corn will be hooked into vertically integrated operations selling their product in the UK. That's the kind of division between organic and conventional that I think is good for African farmers at neither end of the division.
Regina, did you?
Just one small comment. I think the question really is of how much of this change that you just described would have happened in OECD countries' agriculture had there not been an environmental movement that was constantly pressuring for these things to happen. A lot of nitrogen reduction did not just happen because farmers found it more profitable to do so. There was a lot of regulation that was necessary, and that came from that environmental movement. There's certainly also economic rationale for doing that and so on. There's certainly other reasons also. And the other question is how widely shared are actually the opinions you describe. So listening to you, one can get the impression that maybe the majority of people, say in Europe, think like that. But if you look at Eurobarometer, there's a representative survey results. They ask the people the question, do you think that technology in general has a positive impact on your life? And it's a vast majority, around 70% or so of the people say yes. It's only where they don't see the benefit that they're more cautious. But overall, people are not against technology or so. And I think also that the point for African agriculture, I have the impression it's maybe a bit a bit overstated, how much influence that really has on what the Minister of Agriculture does in say, Ghana or Uganda. I mean, you mentioned the IASTD report that has this more foodie kind of culture. I mean, if you do a survey, how many ministers of agriculture actually are aware of that report versus, say, the World Development Report on Agriculture? I'm not sure what the balance would be.
Ann Eflin with the Economic Research Service at U.S. Department of Agriculture. But my question is more about you're in an academic position, and I wonder how your explanations of Green Revolution
Can you speak louder?
And culture wars go over with your students. Do you talk about this in your classes? Because my experience, young people who have a serious interest in farm and food policy, as they become more educated about, with these sort of alternative sets of facts, begin to put this together in the way that the gentleman from World Food Program mentioned, that that they're beginning to see that there's some weight on both sides and looking for a path down the middle. And do you find that you're sort of in an epicenter of the culture wars up there in Massachusetts? Do you find that your students are receptive to learning the other side of the story from what they're getting, kind of in the journalistic world?
It depends on what they're majoring in. If they're majoring in economics or biology, then they can make the connections that I make and can see the benefits. If they're majoring in anthropology or sociology or history or English literature, then they are absolutely persuaded by the other argument. And I fault the academic world for allowing this kind of stovepiping to go on among undergraduates. It's possible to graduate from Wellesley College without taking a single course in economics. It's also possible to graduate as an economics major without taking a single course in sociology or religion. I fault the academic community for perpetuating some of this inability to look for the Hegelian synthesis.
Judy Chambers with the Program for Biosafety Systems here at IFPRI, which is actually a program looking at the regulatory issues around biotechnology introduction in the developing world. And when I don't have my professional hat on in my private life, I'm a member of the Virginia Food Policy Council, which speaks to the counterculture issues that you brought up. And I'm wondering if it might not be, I think the tendency is to sort of group the slow, the organic, and the local folks all together. But I'm wondering if there is some rationality for teasing that counterculture movement out a bit further. And the reason I bring it up is because in my Virginia Food Policy Council work, I see a lot of angst amongst the local folks about co-opting, sort of the organics trying to co-opt the local movement on behalf of what they're trying to promote as well as the rest of the world. And at the international development level, I see also a lot of tension developing between the local movement and the fair trade folks who are worried about what local will do to the social justice issues around fair trade. So I'm just wondering if it might be worthwhile teasing out some of those relationships a bit further, because I don't think, the social counterculture is all that organized or in sync with, a number of the issues that you point out. And I see some possibilities there to actually move the discussion a bit more towards the center.
Thanks, Judy. Those are good comments, and it would be nice if we could disentangle these different approaches. It's interesting. The push for local food was largely driven by the industrialization of organic food. When those who wanted small-scale, local, community-based agricultural systems to flourish realized that the organic certification made no reference to where the food was grown or how large the operation was that grew the food, they said, wait a minute, the organic certification system's not going to get what we want, so they pushed for local. And I'm actually an enthusiast for locally grown food if the goal is freshness, taste, nutrition, support for community-based farming, but it's when they try to claim that you're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When they try to claim that it has a smaller carbon footprint, that's when I get off the bus. Now, and there are elements of organic farming that I enjoy a lot. I shop at Whole Foods when I buy animal products, because I believe conventional agriculture is lagging miserably in extending to farm animals even a minimal guarantee of welfare. And I appreciate the organic standard for what it extends in the way of farm animal welfare. So I'm an organic enthusiast when it comes to animal products, but I don't see any reason to spend more money for any of the other products at Whole Foods. So I guess I would like to disaggregate as much as possible here.
Julie Howard, Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa. Regina and Rob, thank you very much for a thought-provoking presentation. And Regina, thank you very much for giving us the context of India, what happened with the Green Revolution and the LBJ dynamic there. Rob, in some ways, I felt as if the description of the book, as if it came out 3 years ago, and as if the food crisis never happened. So, and I was particularly intrigued about your pessimism about the World Bank, which I think, the World Bank's investment in agriculture has significantly increased under Zelik's leadership. And indeed, in my career, I have not heard the U.S. President mention agriculture assistance and food security in the inaugural address before, and I haven't seen legislation in both houses of Congress significantly boosting U.S. assistance to agriculture and food security. And I also haven't seen in the U.S. sort of the grouping of humanitarian groups and more traditional agricultural boosting groups before. So, I mean, to me, it seems like a significant moment that you have more or less dismissed. So I'm wondering about your pessimism. And then on the other side, perhaps even more significant, you're pointing to national governments and their responsibilities. At the same time, it's a bit early in this game, but at the same time, I have not heard in my career the African Union chair call for all presidents in Africa to have a very significant gain in food production, agricultural production over the next 5 years. We haven't seen what's going on with CADP, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, which seems to me, I mean, unless I'm very misguided, to be increasingly Africa-led and with leaders and with policy makers and groups in countries having the tools facilitated by IFPRI and other organizations to guide their own policies and to work with donors against priorities they set. So I'm just wondering what you make of that. Have you processed that? Have you decided that this is another fad, or what do you have to say?
Okay, thank you, Julie. On the question of Africa, once again, I appreciate all of the AU and CADC and AGRA initiatives, but those initiatives come and go like subway cars in Africa, and my metric is going to be the investments that African governments make, especially in rural public goods, in agricultural research, in farm-to-market roads, in rural clinics, in rural schools. Until I see African governments moving their investments in agriculture from 5% or less today up to their own pledged goal of 10%, I'm not going to I'm going to curb my enthusiasm. Regarding the food crisis, this is a fascinating interlude, and I share your excitement, and I certainly share your hope that the food price spike of 2008 is going to trigger not only the promised doubling of agricultural lending from the World Bank to agriculture in Africa that Zelik promised in 2008, it's also going to, I hope, trigger the increased U.S. agricultural development assistance spending that President Obama pledged at the G20 meeting a year ago. He pledged he would ask Congress for a doubling of U.S. spending. He then leveraged that at the meeting in Italy last summer into a collective pledge of more than $22 billion. And we have a food security initiative that comes out of the State Department then in September. And the appropriations committees did appropriate more for FY 210. But too much of that, in my view, was premised on the need to address the crisis of high food prices on the world market. Now, the high prices on the world market are an imperfect measure of hunger. A lot of those high prices were driven by temporary export bans by governments that were trying to control food price inflation at home in an inflationary moment when all commodity prices were going up. We're now in a different macroeconomic environment since the 2009 recession. Food prices on the world market have fallen by 40 or 50%. You can't get people excited anymore about hunger by pointing to high food prices on the world market because they don't exist anymore. My fear is that if you live by the world market price sword, you're going to die by that sword when the prices come down. There are actually more people chronically undernourished today than there were when those prices were at their peak in 2008, precisely because of the world recession, which has cut income growth in poor countries. It's always when income growth slows, not when international prices are high, that hunger increases in developing countries. So I hope that the appropriations committees of the Congress will give the President what he's asking for. I hope the World Bank reverses its disastrous reduction in lending for agricultural development, but I think it's going to have to be based on a sound long-term view of the real hunger crisis, which is low agricultural productivity in the countryside in poor countries, not a surrogate definition of the hunger crisis based on high prices in the world marketplace.
Thank you. Regina?
Just one quick comment. I actually agree with the person who asked the question. I think there is a moment of hope right now, and I would see that actually much more positive. That doesn't mean by itself that it will actually work out, but past agricultural development history tells us that in a moment of hope, great things can happen. I mean, the Green Revolution did happen, and the point is to understand under which conditions. What were the political incentives to make it happen? Are they there in Africa right now? And I think that has a lot to do with issues like their farmers' movement that are able to hold their governments accountable to actually increase that funding. Maybe that doesn't happen from one year to another, but with more democracy, with more openness, I actually trust that that will happen. So I would be more optimistic. It's not that we can take that for granted, but I think if we try to align our efforts with making it possible and creating the conditions for making it possible that this investment actually results in agricultural development and more food security, I think this is the chance we have to grasp right now.
Thank you. If you'll allow me, I will take 3 more questions and then try and bring the session to a formal close. 4 more, sorry, I missed you. 4 more questions, brief ones, I hope, and brief responses, and then bring the session to close at 1:45 or so. Bobby?
Thank you. My name is Bobby Van Heften, and I am a retired employee of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And when I was at the department, I spent a couple of years in Rome as the agricultural attaché to FAO. And one of the things, I was doing some consulting in Nicaragua last year, and it seemed like the FAO was quite active in this. I'm not quite sure exactly what whether they started it or whether they were promoting or what, but a whole big discussion on food sovereignty. And I was just curious as to what, it may be in your book, but I was just curious, what kind of role is, say, the FAO playing in some of these kinds of discussions, and particularly kind of what role are they playing in the developing countries?
The call for food sovereignty came from an organization named La Via Campesina, which is still active. It was launched in Belgium maybe, 10 or 12 years ago. It's originally an organization that consisted of some federations of European farm organizations plus like-minded federations of farm workers, especially in Central America. I believe Honduras is the country in Central America that's most prominently associated with La Via Campesina. And it's an organization that claims to speak for peasant farmers all over the world, but it does so with such an extreme anti-globalization bias, as though peasant farmers are going to be better off if they don't have access to improved seeds or markets for their crops. It's an organization that, so far as I know, hasn't produced any new research demonstrating the promise of their vision. Where their vision is most actualized among smallholder farmers in Africa, it's not demonstrating results. You can't find a lot of seed vendors and fertilizer salesmen in rural Africa. African farmers are not being tyrannized by profit-making multinational corporations. Multinational corporations don't even show up. There aren't any good customers there. No one has enough money to buy any of the stuff that they're selling. So it's an organization that I think doesn't really deserve equal standing in FAO conferences alongside more traditional groups that have research to show that they're onto something promising, and yet FAO now includes them in their activities. I was in a meeting in FAO last fall, actually. It was at the run-up to the Food Summit, and it was a meeting on technology for food and agriculture, and I was chairing the panel, so I couldn't talk. But there were 4 people on the panel. 3 of them were organic farmers, and the 4th was a leader of a peasants' organization in Southeast Asia. So FAO has felt the need to show extraordinary deference to the counterculture that views the Green Revolution as a mistake rather than an achievement.
I'm Jock Anderson from the humble World Modest Bank. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that I think your pessimism about the reality of the ramping up of agricultural investment is not justified. It is actually happening. And I think it's a great opportunity for your next book to look just how successfully it did happen and just what sort of programs got supported. It won't ramp up as much as it did under Monty Udelman's reign way back in the Dark Ages, but it'll certainly more than double, I'm sure, from its unacceptably low level. So I'm just really supporting what Julie said before, I think. I'd like to just throw another quick question. In your brief statement about the nature of the strength of the farm lobby in the US especially, you didn't mention anything about the 4-H movement. And I have a friend in Illinois who is convinced that the real political power of the farm lobby comes from the early youth training of people with building up their human capital in political dialogue and support for the farm cause. Just a throwaway thought. Thanks.
That might be a testable proposition. Of course, whenever you try to explain U.S. subsidies through reference to something distinctive about the United States, whether it's a Jeffersonian tradition or something about the U.S. Congress or something about something distinctive about the American agricultural past, that forces you to explain why countries that don't have those distinctive traits in Europe and in Japan also have farm subsidies, in fact, more than we have. So what I would want to look for is there an equivalent of the 4-H system in Japan and in Germany and in France and in the UK? And if there is, then maybe you're onto something.
Monty, you were mentioned.
Thank you very much. My name's Monty Udelman, and when I was the Director of Agriculture at the World Bank, 40% of our lending went for agriculture. And one of the reasons for that was because you had a leader at the bank who insisted that that happened. I think that's a factor you have to pay attention to. But I would like to talk about something else, Rob. What would have happened if the Green Revolution failed? Would we have had a big environmental movement? Would we have had the kind of things that you're talking about? That's one thing. The second thing is, as far as power is concerned, and the developed countries, I'd like to give you an illustration of what I call power based on an anecdote in which I was involved. The World Bank made a loan to Brazil to increase sugar production, to increase the supply of ethanol. The Brazilian ethanol supply increased. At the time, the idea was that the Volkswagen Motor Company would produce a series of engines that could use the ethanol. But what happened, of course, things didn't move in sync. So the Brazilians had a surplus of ethanol, which they started exporting to the USA. Archer Daniels, which is the large multinational corporation that produces ethanol in the US, now this is years ago, wrote a letter to the Treasury, which passed it on to the bank, and the President passed on to me, saying that American taxpayers' money was being used to subsidize production in Brazil, which was displacing American workers. McNamara, who was then the president of the bank, asked me to go out to Archer Daniels to discuss this with them. I went, was arrived, Mr. Andreasen, the president, was very gracious. We sat down to talk about it. It was a telephone call. His secretary came in and said it was important. He came back 5 minutes later, smiling, saying, "We don't have a problem." That was Senator Dole. He's just agreed to raise the tariff on Brazilian ethanol by 25%. And that was what I call a real illustration of power. Thank you. And I think that as long as the U.S. political system is based on 2 senators from each state, including many of the states that have small populations but relatively powerful agricultural sectors, you're going to see a continuation of this. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Actually, the phone call that's even more notorious than that, in illustrating the political power of farm lobbies in the United States, was one that was made to President Clinton from one of the Von Hool brothers in Florida. Vice President Gore was promoting an environmental cleanup measure for the Everglades that the sugar industry did not like. And one of these Cuban-American sugar barons from Florida made a phone call to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton interrupted a meeting with Monica Lewinsky to take the phone call and to stop Al Gore from doing anything that the sugar industry in Florida did not like.
Yeah, the last word, last question.
Dr. Farrell, you talked about...
The microphone, one moment.
John Harsh with AgriPulse. Dr. Perlberg, you talk about the perpetual farm bills and perpetual strength of the farm lobbies. How much has changed now that we have a farm kid as Secretary of a city kid rather than a farm kid as Secretary of Agriculture, and we have an organic proponent as Deputy Secretary?
Well, I think that maybe this is back to the multi-agriculturalism. There will now be government support for both models of agriculture. Of course, organic farmers already have government support in the form of an organic standard that allows them to use a credible label and capture the price premium that organics command in the marketplace. We're now probably going to see additional outlays to support the organic alternative. The child nutrition measure will have a little bit money there for organic food in school lunch programs. It will be, but that's the way the Congress does things. It gives money to everybody. It's not necessarily a choice. It's not necessarily disciplined, but neither is it a weakening of agricultural lobbies.
Regina, any final words? And Rob, if you have any final comments. Huh?
Yeah, I think Rob should have the final word. Maybe just one comment on this farm lobby. Well, one can discuss that from various perspectives, from industrialized countries, that the best use of the money and so on. But from a development perspective, I think the most useful thing to do, since one has to deal with what is actually politically feasible, is to look at what kind of that support is really the most damaging one for developing countries, like the cotton case, which is highlighted in the book, and try to reduce those. And there are a lot of subsidies that are not that damaging for developing countries. They may be criticized for other reasons, but I think from a development perspective, it may be most useful to concentrate really on those that hurt farmers in developing countries.
And Rob, also, how can people get this?
It's available from Amazon.com for, I think, $11.95.
Oh,
Ships
bargain.
immediately.
Okay.
That's cheaper than lunch. But actually, very quickly on the Brazilian case, I think that was just settled. And it was settled in a revealing way. The United States government could not agree to comply with the Dispute Settlement Board finding that our cotton policies were in violation of our WTO obligations, because it's Congress that makes those policies, and they won't change them until the 2012 Farm Bill. So what we agreed with the Brazilians on was, as I understand it, we will pay them more than $100 million a year for their permission to continue violating the WTO until or if the Congress finally changes its policies. The alternative would have been Brazilian trade sanctions on the United States that would have hurt sectors other than agriculture. So it's a fascinating outcome that the farm lobby is powerful enough to force the United States government to actually pay subsidies to Brazilians as an alternative to changing U.S. farm subsidy law.